We're beginning our time together this evening with a reading.
A reading from Isaiah 43, chapters 1 to 4. By now, O Jacob, listen to the Lord who created you. O Israel, the one who formed you says, do not be afraid, for I have ransomed you. I have called you by your name. I have called you by name. You are mine. When you go through deep waters, I will be with you. When you go through rivers of difficulty, you will not drown. When you walk through the fire of oppression, you will not be burned up. The flames will not consume you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior. I gave Egypt as a ransom for your freedom. I gave Ethiopia and Seba in your place. Others were given in exchange for you. I traded their lives for yours because you are precious to me. You are honored, and I love you.
Thank you. This is not going to work. I can just see it here now. Okay. Do that later. This is the third time that we have met for our study Dying with Dignity. The first week we had Dr. Brian Curley, a palliative care doctor, with us, and he shared a lot of really great grounding and insight from the field of palliative care. He shared actual case studies that he has experienced, and I think that he really helped us to understand the history around this issue in Canada, around doctor-assisted death, as well as the more recent legal implications of the Supreme Court case in Quebec. Last week, we had Reverend Scott, and Reverend Scott helped us to walk through the response in the Anglican Church. What has been said, what has been studied, what has been articulated by the Anglican Church in Canada in response to these issues, in response to the changing legal terrain in Canada. What I heard last week when we had an opportunity to break into small groups is I heard a lot of compassion. I heard a lot of understanding. I heard a lot of willingness to engage with the complexity of the issue. I heard people articulating that there's a lot of fine lines that we're dealing with here. For example, there's a fine line between sedating somebody as they are approaching death and giving that lethal injection that actually moves us into the realm of doctor-assisted death. I heard a lot of compassion for the changing legislation, but also compassion for doctors who might be put in a tough situation. And certainly Dr. Curley articulated feeling that he himself, he could end up in a very strange and uncomfortable position in trying to care for his patients if the legislation changes and if he himself does not feel comfortable with assisting somebody in death. I heard a lot of understanding for the complexity around that fine line between somebody making that choice for themselves and somebody making that choice on somebody else's behalf. For example, in the case of the Latimer case, I think that was in the 1990s. As Reverend Scott said last week, we're not here to solve this issue. We're here to have open and honest dialogue, and I celebrate the honesty and the compassion that I heard last week. I celebrate that we seem to be able to talk about this without judging one another and without making labels on one another if we happen to find different ways of articulating this, understanding this, believing this. And I hear that a lot of us come at this from our experience. So it can feel very personal and feel like what we're talking about is very, very personal. Now tonight I began with the passage from Isaiah, which I think is a very beautiful passage. And you'll see that I put up some of the symbols of our faith here. The candle should be lit. I'll deal with that later. Water, the water of baptism. And these are the blessed ashes from our last Ash Wednesday service. In the Christian faith, we have a lot of resources. We are well equipped to be able to talk about death. We're well equipped to be able to talk about death honestly and openly. And that is one of the gifts of being part of the church. Because, when I look at the culture around us, I see a lot of focus on youth, and I see a lot of focus on wanting to always stay young, and I see a lot of violence, but I don't see a lot of people just talking honestly and openly about the fact that if we live, we also die. Now, we had a baptism this past Sunday, and it can be a little bit jarring if you're really paying attention to the language of baptism, because the language of death is woven through the language of life. And that seems strange, especially when we're welcoming tiny babies into the waters of baptism, to be talking about death. But in fact, we are in our baptism not only saying something about the kind of life that we are choosing to live, we're also saying something about our belief that death doesn't have the last word on our lives, and that there is a life that opens up to us beyond death, that we don't need to fear death. I have these ashes up here because that is probably, for me, one of the most poignant points of the Christian year, is when we gather on Ash Wednesday, and we are marked with the ashes. And the priest says over those ashes, over each person, you are dust, and to dust you shall return. We're meant, as Christians, to keep our mortality in front of us. And yet all of these things, all of this language around death and life, these rituals that we do, these symbols that we use, they are laden with hope. These are not depressing conversations. They are hope-filled conversations, even while they are honest conversations. So I bring us back to our baptism tonight. And I want to begin with the very first part of the baptismal covenant. I will continue in the apostles' teaching and fellowship, in the breaking of bread, and in the prayers. What I hear in this first part of our baptismal covenant is I hear the gift of community articulated. That as Christians, we are to grow in our relationship with God, and we are to enter into the fullness of what life is all about by walking together. By sharing together in the prayers, sharing together in the stories of our faith, sharing together in the communion, the community of our faith. One of the great gifts of community is our stories. And I noted just a few minutes ago how personal this conversation can feel for all of us. because probably somewhere along the line, most of us have some kind of experience of death. And so, however we feel about this issue around doctor-assisted suicide is probably somehow grounded not only in our faith, but also in our experience. I want to share with you tonight a couple of my stories. A couple of my stories of where I have experienced dying with dignity. Now, I noted last week that phrase, dying with dignity, is often used by the pro-doctor-assisted suicide camp. But I think as Christians, we need to have a bigger imagination about what dignity means and what it means to die with dignity. So I share 3 stories as a priest, but also just as a person. And the first story that I want to share is of my grandmother. Her name is Alma. My grandmother, 4 years ago, Mother's Day, came down with a raging case of pneumonia. And she was rushed to the hospital. And a couple of days later, the family was called in. And we were told that she probably wouldn't make it through the night. It was pretty awful to watch. She was gasping for every breath. And she was in a total panic every time that she was trying to take breath into her lungs. I have to wonder that if the legislation had been different, and if she had made particular advanced care plans, I have to wonder whether that would have been a case where the doctor would have agreed that this suffering was too much and that she needed to just be eased into a peaceful death. We brought her priest in, and we had last rites, last prayers, final thanksgivings over her body. And as soon as we did that, she rallied. She wasn't done. She had 3 months in the hospital that was a very tough recovery, and it really wasn't until she came home that fall that she really started to get better. But she did improve remarkably after that near-death experience. There were 2 other great-grandchildren that were born to her in the years that she had left with us. And she lived a really wonderful quality of life. She was able to regain her mental capacity and to thoroughly enjoy her great-grandchildren, being at home, all of the blessings of life. This past December, as many of you know, she got pneumonia again. And the family was called in again. This time it was just my brother and me and my mom and my dad. And we knew that she wasn't going to make it. And we just sat with her. And she had a very peaceful death. And there was a sense of lightness and peace in the room, and there was also incredible sadness. But it was a lovely experience. So that's one story, not as a priest, but just as a granddaughter. I had another experience as a priest of being called in to see a woman who was in palliative care, who I didn't know at all. And she wasn't a member of any church, but she had been Anglican by background. She was in unbelievable pain. to the point that even my putting my hands on her head to offer her a blessing, she would ask me not to touch her so hard, because even that hurt. She was filled with cancer. She was in a tremendous amount of pain. And again, I imagine that she probably would have been a candidate for doctor-assisted death if the legislation were different at that time. And she probably would have requested it, and she would have been capable of requesting it. I met with her for a number of times before she actually died. And what I discovered in meeting with her was that she had been alienated from the church for many decades. And that there was an important piece of reconciliation that needed to happen. It really mattered to her that the church came to her after all of those years of alienation. You know, she wasn't well treated by the church. And there was some real healing that took place in that time that I had with her, even in the midst of that intense pain. The other thing about that case is that her daughter basically gave up normal life in order to be with her mother through those weeks. And so she wasn't alone. She had family with her, and she was in a lot of pain, but she was well supported, and there was some important healing taking place. The third story was also, as a priest, I was called into a woman who was my mother's age. Her family called me in, and she had been battling cancer only for a couple of months at that point, but none of the treatments had gone well. And her family were devastated at coming to a point where essentially they had to choose whether to continue to keep her artificially alive in order to try further treatments, or basically to unplug and to let her go. And so they called me in. The nurses, the doctors had all given their advice that they felt like they had run out of options, that it was unfair to keep her artificially alive. And so I helped them to talk about the need now for peace. That this woman had fought, and she had really tried to work with all of the treatments. Every last attempt had been exhausted. She had fought, and now it was time for peace. And so the machines were unplugged, and the family was there with her, and I was there with the family, and it took 20 minutes before she breathed her last. Her daughter told me later that her daughter wasn't a churchgoer, told me later that just as her mother was breathing her last, she saw a flash of light come out of her stomach. And it was in the room for a moment, just for a moment. All three of those stories, in my opinion, were stories of dying with dignity. And each one of them had a lot of pain involved in them. Each one of them had suffering in them. And yet I would say that each one of those stories was an experience of dying with dignity. I'm going to invite you to join into small groups. So last week it seemed to work pretty well. People self-regulated quite well to get into groups of, say, between probably six people. I think 6 is probably good. And if you feel comfortable, so understanding, I just want to say right at the outset, this can be very personal, and you may or may not be in a place where you feel like you want to share a story. But if you have a story to share, and you feel comfortable sharing it, where have you seen an experience of dying with dignity? And what made that an experience of dying with dignity? What were the elements that would make you say that there was a sense of blessing or peace or dignity or wholeness in that experience of death? Okay, so 6 or so people.